Do you work on a lot of projects in your garage and you still want to be able to park your cars in your garage when your projects are finished? Well, if that's the case, I have the perfect solution for you. I ended up building this fold-up workbench and it has been a game changer for me. So in this video, I'm going to take you through all the steps of what it takes to put one of these benches together. And I'll also include a materials list in the video description below that you can check out after the video is over. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. I decided to cut the tabletop out first. I took a standard 4x8 sheet and ripped it down to the final dimensions of 76 inches by 36 inches. Now you can do this a couple of different ways. I ended up taking this attachment from Craig that attaches to a circular saw and it lets you rip down large sheets of material. Now you can also use a table saw if you have one. And another option would be to have this ripped down to the size that you want it at the store before you bring it home. Now I ended up using 3/4 inch MDF for this. However, I'd highly recommend using standard plywood as it's going to hold up longer and be a little bit more durable. The reason I went with MDF in the first place is simply because I had some extra pieces laying around that I hadn't used in a long time. After the top was cut, I transitioned to cutting all the 2x4s down to the appropriate size for all the different pieces I needed to complete the workbench. You'll use standard 2x4s for the skirt of the table, the legs, and even to mount this to the wall. The fastest way to do this is to simply cut all similar sized pieces at the same time, and in order to keep everything straight once you have everything cut, I wrote down the use for each of the pieces with a pencil on every piece of 2x4 that I cut. Once all the pieces were cut and laid out, I decided to go ahead and take the time to sand everything down now, getting rid of any rough spots along the edges where I cut, including any rough spots that were on the boards from the factory. I ended up using 120 grit sandpaper for this step, although you could use sandpaper that's rougher than this. The goal for this is to simply get rid of all the really rough edges and to eliminate any possibility of getting a splinter. I figured this is the best time to do this because once everything's assembled, it's going to be a little bit harder to sand everything down the way I want it. The next step was to start assembling the legs, and in order to help get everything lined up, I ended up taking a standard 2x4 and clamping it to the tabletop we had just cut out. Having that 2x4 as a guide helped me align everything a lot faster. To eliminate any chance of splitting, I always like to pre-drill my holes with a 1/8 inch drill bit before I put in any deck screws. Now I know deck screws are designed to prevent splitting as it is, but I have had instances, especially when I'm trying to put a screw in at the edge of a board or in some ingrain, where it would split the board anyway. For each of the legs, you'll attach a 24-inch piece and a 7-inch piece at opposite ends of the 34.5-inch solid 2x4. This allows for a gap towards the bottom of the legs that will be used to attach another 2x4 that will be used to brace the legs, and we'll install that support at a later step. I didn't want to use any glue for this build, so I used 2.5-inch deck screws pretty much everywhere. That includes the leg assembly, the skirt assembly, even attaching the top of the table to the skirt itself, which we'll get into here in a minute. But I wanted to keep this simple, straightforward, and I didn't want to have to wait for glue to dry in order to finish this build. Once the legs are assembled, we'll need to take the longest end of the leg and mark a location that's 1 5/8 inches down from the top. That's going to be the location where we install the bolt. This bolt is going to allow us to fold the legs in and out for storage. We'll also need to round off the top corners where the bolt goes in order to allow the board to pivot in place. Now you can use a compass to mark this radius, but I found a can of beans works just fine. To cut the radius, you can use a bandsaw if you have one available. I don't, however, so I ended up using my 12-inch miter saw to cut off most of the material. And to get rid of the rest, I used 60 grit sandpaper attached to my orbital sander. After the bolt location was marked and everything was rounded off, I went ahead and added one more screw towards the top to hold that section together. Since I don't have a drill press, I used a scratch awl to make a hole between the two boards where I needed to drill the hole. Since the hole was already started, that helped eliminate the drill from skipping around when I started out. You should drill about halfway through and then flip the boards over to start on the other side of the hole. This will help prevent any blowout. We'll be using 3/8 inch hex bolts in these locations, so you'll need to use a 3/8 inch drill bit. Now you might need to ream the hole out a little bit by wobbling the drill bit back and forth slightly. That'll help make sure everything is smooth when it operates. For the lower leg brace, you're going to find the center point on 2 of the remaining 31-inch long boards. This is going to allow you to mark a location where we're going to cut a pocket. These pockets will allow us to create a support and prevent the legs from folding in on themselves as the table's in use. To cut the pocket, we'll use a circular saw and we'll set the blade depth to 1 3/4 of an inch, which is exactly half of a 3.5 inch wide 2x4. Once you cut along both of your marks, you can come back with the circular saw and make multiple passes on the material in between that you're going to remove. Then you'll simply take a hammer to remove those remaining pieces, and then you might need to clean out the rest of the material in the hole with a chisel, but otherwise it's a pretty straightforward process. And again, this is a great time to sand down any rough edges before you move on. Now that we have the legs pretty much done, we're going to go ahead and transition to assembling the skirt for the tabletop. We're going to go put that together and then attach it to the top. The reason I haven't done that up until this point is because I wanted a nice surface to work off of without having to worry about interfering with the skirt. So that's why I'm saving that part until now. And I think it really paid off because it was very helpful to assemble most of the components with the tabletop in place instead of on the floor like I'm used to doing. To assemble the skirt, you'll need the two 74-inch long 2x4s and two of the three 31-inch long boards that you cut earlier. These dimensions will allow our tabletop to have about an inch worth of overhang around every edge. To assemble the skirt, we'll use two 2.5-inch deck screws on each corner. If you have clamps, using them for this step and to attach the skirt to the top is very helpful. Then for the remaining 31-inch board, you'll use it as a support in the center of the table, so make sure you mark the center location, and then install it with 2 screws on each side. To attach the skirt to the top, we'll use that same 3/8-inch drill bit we used earlier for the bolt holes, and we'll put a piece of tape on it to mark a depth of 1.5 inches. That'll allow us to use the 2.5-inch screws that we've already been using and set them at a depth where they won't poke through the top. Start by drilling the countersunk holes on the corner, and then with your corner, before you attach the screws, make sure you have the appropriate overhang. Like I said, it should be about 1 inch all around. Using a clamp next to each of these holes as you're attaching the screw will help make sure the boards are flat up against the top. I wanted to make sure there were enough screws holding the top down to the skirt, especially since the screws are only penetrating the top by about 1/2 inch. So I ended up adding 8 screws to each of the long sides and about 3 screws to each of the center supports. So this is where I messed up, and this is actually a great point to keep in mind. When I drilled out all of the holes for the screws, I didn't clear off all of the sawdust, and unfortunately a lot of that got underneath the skirt, between the skirt and the tabletop itself. So what happened was when I tightened the skirt down to the top, it did not lay flat. So I ended up having to take all the screws out of the skirt, removing the skirt, cleaning off the tabletop completely, and then putting it back in place. All of that extra work could have been avoided if I had just taken a little bit of extra time to clean up the work area. With the skirt attached to the top, it's now time to attach the legs to the skirt. So again, we're going to take that same 3/8-inch drill bit to drill a hole in the skirt. We'll put the leg in place so we know exactly where that hole's supposed to go. And again, with this hole, you're probably going to need to ream it out just a little bit so that way the bolt and everything moves smoothly and it doesn't bind up. So these are 3/8-inch hex bolts that are 6 inches long. We're going to use those along with 3 fender washers. One fender washer is going to go on the outside of the skirt. Another washer is going to go between the skirt and the leg. And then the last washer is going to go just between the leg and the nut. I'm using 2 nuts at the end of the bolt. The second nut is there to prevent the first nut from loosening up over time. I also made another mistake and put a skirt screw where the bolt was supposed to go. So I had to remove that screw in order to install the bolt in the leg. And then I just ended up moving the screw about 1 inch and putting it back in place. For the lower support brace, it's fairly straightforward. You just need to make sure it's in the slot snugly and that the notch is facing up. For the top leg stop, you'll need to make sure the legs are open at a 90-degree angle before you attach the board to the legs. For the wheels, I went with these retractable workbench casters. These were really easy to install. I ended up getting this set off of Amazon, and so I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to pick these up too. For the 71-inch leg support brace, you'll need to cut a notch that's 1 3/4 of an inch by 1 3/4 of an inch, and that notch is going to fit into the slot of the lower leg support. And optionally, you can take a router with either an 1/8 inch or a 1/4 inch roundover bit to help smooth out the top edge. For the wall mount, it's easiest to use the bench to mark the location on the wall. Take a pencil and run along the bottom edge of the workbench top, and that will give you the height of your wall mount. It's easiest to first mark the corners behind the workbench top and then take something that has a straight edge and mark the rest of the line. Next, you'll want to take a stud finder and mark the location of all the studs in the wall. You'll need to do this for both the bottom and the top wall mounts. For the bottom wall mount, you'll need to cut out a notch in the top of it so that way the table can set in the notch and not slip off of the mount. The easiest way to do this is to use a table saw, and I left a lip that was 1/4 of an inch high and wide. Next, you'll need to find the center of the location where you're installing the wall mount and mark that on the wall mount board. You'll also need to then measure the distance between the center mark and the studs so that way you know exactly where to place the lag bolts when they're installed. Before installing the wall mount with the lag bolts, I used some more deck screws to tack the wall mount up to the wall to check and make sure everything was in the right location and to mark the location for the top mount. Again, when installing the lag bolts, be sure to pre-drill the holes because you don't want a 2x4 busting in half behind the drywall. For the top wall mount, we're bringing back the can of beans. We're using this as a template to make a rounded latch that will hold the table in place. I made this latch about 4.5 inches long, but in all honesty, it should have been either 4.25 or maybe even 4 inches long. So when you're making this yourself, be sure to check before you make your final cuts. For the board that's mounted to the wall, use a 2x4 that's about 36 inches long. That should allow you to hit all the studs you need in the wall. And also here I was showing I was using a 1x3 to attach to the wall. However, that ended up not being thick enough for the tabletop, so I switched it out to another 2x4. And to attach this top mount to the wall and to make the latch spin, we're using, again, some deck screws. And for the center latch screw, the one that attaches it to the wall, we're also spacing it out with a 1/4 inch washer. Now, once you've reached this stage, you're pretty much done. Now, granted, you could probably do some other things if you wanted to, like paint it, for example, but otherwise, that's it. Hopefully this video was helpful to you. If it was, I appreciate you hitting that like button. It really does help me out. And also, check out this other video here. I'm sure you'll like it too. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.